أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين إن يكن غنيا أو فقيرا فالله أولى بهما فلا تتبعوا الهوى أن تعدلوا وإن تلووا أو تعرضوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. We have been discussing over these nights Nahjul Balagha, a collection of the sermons, letters and sayings of our first Imam, Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And we've covered a variety of topics which Imam talks about. We've spoken about taqwa, about the Holy Quran, about spirituality, about psychology. But one of the key areas which cannot be missed out when analyzing this book is government and politics. Because most of it was compiled regarding the time when the Imam was Khalifa. And we started a specific discussion yesterday looking at the exchanges that Imam had with Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan. And tonight, inshaAllah, we will look at his governance and his justice more generally. Now, after yesterday's discussion, we may ask the question, why is it that there was so much hatred, particularly from Banu Umayyah against Imam Ali? Given that Imam Ali was the hero of Islam, he protected the Holy Prophet and saved Islam on a number of different occasions, both on and off the battlefield, why is it there was such enmity against him? And it was so much that the Imam was actually cursed from the mimbars of the Islamic Empire, the very religion which he helped establish. Its places of preaching were now used to insult his holy name. And this is a very well documented fact of history. For example, in Sahih Muslim, in the book of the virtues of Imam Ali, the book of the virtues of the companions, specifically under Imam Ali, Muawiyah, he asks Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, ما منعك أن تسب أبا تراب? What prevents you from cursing, from reviling, from insulting, from belittling Abu Turab, meaning Imam Ali alayhi salam? And then he gives a beautiful hadith, 3 reasons why he does not. And this is well established in Ibn Kathir's Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, Tarikh al-Tabari, Ibn Hajar Asqalani. A lot of these people, they talk about it because it was a well established fact of history for several decades. And the irony is that not only was Imam used as a mizan of hypocrisy, right? Sahih Muslim, again, book of the virtues of the companions. Imam Ali alayhi salam, it is said about him, Ya Ali, no one will love you except a mu'min, no one hates you except a hypocrite.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
But more specifically on the topic of cursing, in the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim, in a hadith which is accepted as sahih by Al-Dhahabi, the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi,
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
he says, whoever has reviled or cursed Ali ibn Abi Talib, he has in fact cursed me. And there is no surprise there that there is an equivalency between cursing Imam Ali and cursing the Holy Prophet. Because this was the man who saved Islam at so many different battles. He was the champion at Badr. He was the one who stayed behind, the only one uncontroversially, who heroically stayed behind and saved the Holy Prophet at the Battle of Uhud. He's there at the Battle of Khaybar, the Battle of Hunayn. He's there at Da'watul Ashira. He's there at Ghadir. All the way through the life of the Holy Prophet. From the moment he opens his eyes right until the time that he buries him, Imam Ali is the shadow of the Prophet. So no wonder there is an equivalency there. Now, in answer of this question, why was there such enmity against the Imam? Alam al-Majlisi, in his Bahar al-Anwar, his mammoth collection of hadith, he has a chapter which he devotes to this. And he gives two answers to this question. He says the first is because of the Battle of Badr. At the Battle of Badr, many of the main heads of the Quraysh, they were killed. And of about 70 of the main enemy forces that were killed on that day, 35 fell to the sword of Imam Ali. And that included 3 first-degree relatives of Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan from Banu Umayyah. And after this, regarding this, Abdullah ibn Umar, the son of the second Khalifa, on one occasion he said to Imam Ali that, Ya Ali, this battle of Badr, it did not leave you with any friends, did it? And Imam responded, no, what you've said is not enough. For the battle of Badr did not even leave me with any false friends. Because the enmity had burgeoned so much after his accomplishments there. And it was so deeply entrenched, this hatred, that it was passed from generation to generation. Because Yazid, as Ibn Kathir, he records in Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, when he has Imam al-Husayn's head in his court, and the family of Ahlul Bayt have been vanquished, he says what? I wish my ancestors from Badr were here in order to witness this. Yazid wasn't even born at the time of the Battle of Badr. But he has such generational hatred that he has inherited from his father, Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, that he still has this wish. So that is the first. And Imam Ali alayhi salam, he knows this. That's why in some of the letters he uses against Muawiyah, he makes reference to this. In letter number 64, for example, he says that I still have the sword, O Muawiyah, that I used to dispatch your grandfather and your uncle and your brother in one and the same place at the Battle of Badr.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
But the second reason that Alam al-Majlisi gives is because of the justice of Imam Ali. Imam Ali was uncompromisingly just to the principles of justice that his master and teacher, the Holy Prophet, had given him. And with justice there comes difficulty. Because when you're in a position of difficulty, yes, justice, it tastes sweet. But when you're in a position of power and you have the ability to twist the scales in your favor, that's when it becomes more difficult. And there are many different examples where this impacted the people around the Imam. And we can apply this on ourselves as well. That how just are we in our day-to-day interactions, particularly when it is not in our own interest. But Imam in Nahjul Balagha, he specifically states that justice is to bear witness even against yourself, even when it is not in your benefit. That is what haqq is. So there are many examples where Imam established justice that cost him politically. For example, yesterday we spoke a little bit about the nepotistic tendencies of the third Khalifa, and we provided some very authentic, accepted narrations from reliable sources with reliable chains of narration about this. And Imam Ali, one of the first things he did was he undid this nepotism. And we'll look at his stance on nepotism later on, inshallah, tonight. He also dismisses, amongst many people, Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan. And he was not a man to go quietly. It's one of the reasons why the Battle of Siffin took place. And he identifies in letter number 70 of Nahjul Balagha, he says that people don't leave me because they have seen oppression. They leave me because of justice. He goes into a bit more detail in the letter quite eloquently. And again, I'll reference the letters and the saying, so if anyone's interested, they can look at the full wordings because there's so much beauty in there. It's just very difficult to give it all in one discussion. And so the justice of Imam Ali is the main topic for tonight's discussion. But before speaking specifically about justice, it's important to talk about the vehicle that he used to deliver that justice. And that is, of course, his governance, his khilafah. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in Surah Al-Hadid, verse number 25, لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانَ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ. We sent our messengers with clear signs and the scripture and the balance in order to what? Establish justice. That is how central a tenet it is of Islam, and that the very purpose of sending prophets revolves around this concept of adal. Now within the Islamic tradition, government features very heavily. And Allama Tabatabai, he pins the foundation of it in one particular verse of the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Imran, verse number 144. At the Battle of Uhud, when Mus'ab ibn Umair, one of the companions of the Holy Prophet, a truly wonderful Sahabi, a young man who resembled the Holy Prophet somewhat, in the heat of battle when he fell, some people thought that the Holy Prophet had fallen. And that's why so many people fled from the Battle of Uhud. Because they thought, well, if Rasulullah is no more, then why are we even here? What are we doing? And Allah responded to this. Muhammad is but a messenger. Messengers have passed away before him. If he dies or is slain, would you turn back on your heels? And Allama Tabatabai, he argues that a way to understand this verse is that supposedly if the Prophet is killed, do the social systems and military organizations of the Muslims, do they die with him? And the obvious answer based on this verse is no. That what the Holy Prophet establishes, it continues. And this is somewhat different to Christianity. Because we read in the Bible, for example, Mark 12:17, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God what things are God's. But this clear distinction is not found within the religion of Islam. Now, exactly how that manifests in government and politics in a modern sense, that is a discussion for another time, because there's some controversy about that. But there is no doubt that Islam has a lot to say about governance. And Allama Tabatabai, he then quotes a Hasan hadith from Sunan Abu Dawud, where the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says, when he's talking about the importance of leadership, he says that if you leave with a group of 3 people, make sure you appoint at least one of those ones as the leader. That is how fundamental leadership is within the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet. And it was the Kharijites, the Khawarij, who were the first to argue against the very concept of Islamic leadership. When they said, La hukum illallah, that there's no hukum except the hukum of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course this was a perversion, it was a deliberate confusion between divine legislation versus governmental legislation. And Imam, of course, he argues against this. But when it comes to leadership, Imam saw it only as a vehicle for goodness. That was it. If it did not have that association, then it was useless. And this is very Platonic. It features very heavily in Plato's Republic. For example, Plato, he says, in the city of good men, so imagining a sort of perfect government, he says if a perfect government came into being, the citizens would fight each other in order not to rule. In the same way that in today's society, they fight in order to rule. They would be quite clear that anybody who is really a true leader does not naturally seek what is advantageous to himself, but what is advantageous to his subjects. So in other words, summarizing, it's often misquoted, but summarizing this point, those who are most qualified to lead are those who are least likely to chase after leadership. And is there a more perfect example in history than Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi?
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
In sermon number 33, Imam sits down and he's repairing some of his shoes. And it looks like these shoes have been repaired many times. Because he asks one of his companions who is there, Abdullah ibn Abbas, he asks him, "Oh Ibn Abbas, what do you think the worth of these shoes are?" Ibn Abbas, he looks in politely, he says, "Ya Ali, I don't think they're worth anything." And Imam Ali alayhi salam said, "By Allah, this is worth more to me, these shoes, than the entire khilafah, if it is not used to establish justice and give the rights to the Muslims." That was his impression of governance. And in sermon number 3 of Shaqshaqiyya, he says that if it's not used for righteousness, it is worth less to me than the sneeze of a goat.
Allahumma salli ala
It was a poisoned chalice, and Imam, he knew this. He knew that it was a poisoned chalice, that the situation had deteriorated so much that whoever was to take Khilafah at that time, they would face difficulty after difficulty. And yet, as he says in sermon number 3, he only accepts it because he knows it is his responsibility to give to the Muslims what they otherwise would not have. And he says, there are descriptions in Nahjul Balagha that when people come to give him allegiance, they flock in such numbers that they were almost crushing Imam al-Hasan, Imam al-Hussein. We looked at this yesterday, to the point that even Imam's clothes were torn at his shirt because people were so desperate for him to take the reins of Khilafah. He did not want government other than to give it to the people. And Imam was committed to justice both in his words and in his actions. For example, in his words, one of the most beautiful commitments to justice, sermon number 223. He says, "By Allah, I would rather spend a night of wakefulness lying on the thorned plant of Sa'dan," which is a very thorny, prickly plant, "or be driven in chains as a prisoner, rather than meeting Allah and His Messenger on the day of judgment as an oppressor or a usurper of anything of worldly wealth. For how can I oppress in order to take benefit in this temporary life at the cost of the permanent one?"
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
He is the embodiment of his sermon of Muttaqeen, which we spoke about in another night. He has his heart is in the other world. One foot in this world, one foot in the next. And in his actions, we see his commitment to justice even at his own cost. Yesterday, again, we went over lots of examples where he put principles over results. For example, sermon number 200, where he says that he is smarter than Muawiyah, he is more cunning than him, but he does not use deceit, for every deceit is a sin and every sin is an offense to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we'll see tonight many examples where he establishes this principle. But when Imam talks about rulership and governance, he talks about it in what appears to be a very modern sense, what is not seen by most of the rulers in history. Because he says in sermon 216 that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has enjoined many rights upon mankind. But the greatest of these rights is the rights between the ruler and the ruled, and the ruled over the ruler. It is a mutual relationship. He says, consequently, the ruler cannot prosper unless the rulers are sound, and the rulers cannot be sound unless the ruled are steadfast. There is a symbiotic relationship here. There is a feedback cycle between the two. And if that balance goes either way, there is trouble. He says in the same letter, "But if the ruled gained any sway over the ruler, or the ruler oppresses the ruled, then the difference crops up in every word, signs of oppression appear, mischief enters religion, and the ways of the sunnah are forsaken." So there is a relationship between the two, and each have a right over one another. And Imam applies this criteria specifically to himself. He leads by example. This is the beauty of Ahlul Bayt. In sermon number 73, he says that if someone is a leader over a people, they should start by educating themselves before educating others. They should master their own conduct before looking at the conduct of others. And after they have taught and instruct their own selves, only then are they in a position where they can teach and instruct others. And there's a few examples where we see this. We'll look at a few examples before moving on. Number one, with regards to praise. In sermon 216, Imam, he says, do not praise him. Generally, people feel pleased at praise after good performances. But to me, do not mention handsome praise. And he says, do not evade me, as people of passion are to be evaded. Do not meet me with flattery. And do not think that if you bring something critical, something that you don't think I would want to hear, that I would be offended by it, that I would take it ill. And that do not abstain from saying any truth or pointing any manner of justice, for I do not consider myself above erring. So Imam says that not only does he hold himself to that standard, he says that if any time you feel anything is slipping, you come and you say it with the utmost courage, for there will be no consequences. And how far the Muslims of the world, the Muslim leaders of the world today have strayed from this path. That if we don't even say anything to their face, if something is just said on social media, or it is said in a private conversation, if word gets to many of the Muslim leaders of the world today, that's game over. What happened to the morals of Islam? And you can imagine his humility, that he's finally got his right of khilafah. He can finally put things right, and the first thing he does is he says, hold me to account. Imagine that, the humility. Imam Ali is saying, he's telling the people to hold him to account. Another example is regarding respect. And we looked at this in saying number 37 of Nahjul Balagha when we were speaking about psychology, that he told people not to run after his horse out of respect, because to do so is to imbue arrogance within the leaders. And he says, you do that to your chiefs, you will help them to go towards hellfire. And a third example is regarding the issues with manipulation of psychology. He says in lecture number 45, again in our discussion in psychology and Nahjul Balagha, we looked at this in more depth, but he takes the example of Uthman ibn Hunayf, who is one of his governors, who just accepted a sumptuous meal with no obvious strings attached. Imam, he castigates him. This is lecture number 45. On another occasion, there's a companion of the Imam called Ahnaf ibn Qais, and he approaches the Imam in order to open his fast with him. And when Imam sits down, he simply has a pouch, and in that pouch there is a little bit of flour. And when he takes it out, it's been tied shut. It's almost been locked shut. That's what it looks like. So Ahnaf, he humorously, he says, oh Imam, why did you have to tie it up so tightly? Did you think that someone was going to steal from it? And Imam smiled, he said, no, but I thought that maybe Imam al-Hussein or Imam al-Hassan, they'd put some butter in it for me. They'd make it a little bit more palatable, a little bit more tasty. And so Ahnaf, he was confused. He said, but Ya Ali, butter is not haram. If they did that, what would the problem be? And Imam, he said, this is in Ihqaq al-Haq, that no, they are not forbidden, but it is incumbent on leaders and rulers to keep their food simple, like that of the common man, so that the poor may not complain of iniquity and the rich have no excuses to indulge in excesses. And Imam, he looked after the property of the people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah An-Nisa verse 58, Allah commands you to give trusts back to their owners, that when you judge between the people, judge with justice. And Imam, he does this in three main ways. We'll look at three categories of examples. One, personally, himself looking after the property of the mu'mineen, number one. Number two, in a governmental sense generally, and number three, in a governmental sense specifically. Starting with his own personal example, again in Ihqaq al-Haq, there is a tradition that talks about the time when Talha and Zubair, two of the prominent companions of the Holy Prophet, they come into the room where Imam Ali alayhi salam, he is doing some governmental work. So he's working through some paperwork. And when they enter, they see that he is doing it in the darkness, but there is one candle on the table that is lighting his papers. That's what he's able to use in order to see. And when they enter, they start to speak to the Imam. The Imam politely interrupts them and says, 1 second, can I just clarify what you're about to say? Is it a governmental affair or is it a personal conversation? And they said, Ya Ali, it's a personal conversation. And so Imam immediately, he extinguishes the candle. He reaches inside the drawer, he takes out a second candle, puts that on the table, lights that. The Talha and Zubair, they're bemused. What on earth was that about? Right? The room was perfectly lit before, and you've just lit an identical candle. What was the benefit? And Imam Ali alayhi salam, he smiled and he said that first candle was bought with the money of the Muslims. And so I cannot use any of it for anything personal. Whilst this second candle was bought with my own money, and therefore I will use it to light our conversation. So personally, this was the attention to detail he had in looking after the property of his followers. But also in governmental policy, generally he was quite strict and careful. Again, in a way which is very ahead of his time. Saying 315, he says to his secretary, Ubaydullah ibn Abi Rafi', he says that when you have the ink pot that you're using for governmental documents, put some cotton in there, a cotton flake. Keep the nib of your pen long and leave space between the lines, but keep the letters up close, because this is more beautiful, this is good for writing. When Imam is using the money of the Muslims, he becomes very parsimonious. He says, keep the letters very close together, keep the nib long, right, so that the writing is thinner. And he says, put some cotton in the ink pot, it reduces the amount of ink that is used. For two reasons. One, because you want to use as little as possible from the property of the Muslims. But number two, also as a leader of a government, there are lots of documents which are issued. And so even if you reduce the amount of paper and ink usage by 5% across an entire empire, that has a huge difference. So Imam, he was very careful with the money of the Muslims generally, but also specifically. In lecture number 5, he sends a lecture to one of his governors, Ash'ath ibn Qais, who has been accused of corruption. Now Ash'ath originally, he thought, okay, Ya Ali, if you're going to accuse me of corruption, I'll just go over to Muawiyah's side. But his tribe, they said, look, this is dishonorable. So he was convinced by them, he came over to Imam Ali. And Imam Ali alayhi salam found him with 400,000 dinars, which was far more than he could have had if he was being honest. So Imam took 370,000 of them away from him, dismissed him from his position and gave that money back to the Muslims. So Imam was very careful when it came to looking after the property of his people. When it came to ruling his people, he was very soft and he was very kind. For example, in lecture number 18, he tells Abdullah ibn Abbas to be very kind to the people of Basra, that there was some reports of a little bit of harshness. And Imam, he asks him just to tone things down a little bit, particularly on the people of Banu Tamim. And when this very city rebelled against him, Imam Ali, he forgave them. And he said that as long as you stay within your allegiance and you don't betray me again, consider it forgotten. But then he also, in Imam Ali's classic eloquent style, he warns them. He says, but if you rise up again, then I will fight you in such a way that it will make the battle of Jamal look like light work. But he forgave them. He looked after them well. And this was in lecture number 29. And even on one of the harshest interactions between government and subjects, it's tax collection, right? That's when we tend to remember the government the most, and that's when we hate the government the most, especially that time of year. Lecture number 25, Imam, he says, regarding the collection of the taxes, move on with the fear of Allah, who has no partner. Do not frighten any Muslim. Do not pass over his lands in a way that makes him unhappy. Do not take from him more than Allah's share in his property. When you go to a tribe, don't go inside their houses, meet them at their watering places, so that they're not uncomfortable. And then proceed towards them with peace and dignity, and with the utmost respect say to them that I have come from the representative of Allah, the Khalifa, to come and take Allah's right from your property. And if they say that they have nothing to give, then you accept that. And if they have something to give, then you take it. And go with him without frightening him, without threatening him, without pressuring him, without oppressing him. Do not even scare any animal. Do not tease anyone, and do not even leave any of the owners grieved about anyone. There's a similar message in lecture number 51 as well. Again, more instructions to his tax collectors. But although he was soft with his people, he was very harsh with his own governors, because they were his representatives. In lecture number 3, there's a very harsh rebuke of Shuraih al-Qadhi, when he buys a rather expensive house in a good area of town. So there is some suspicion. And Imam says your house has 4 boundaries. The first is contiguous with calamities, the second with distress, the third with devastating desire, and the fourth with the deceit of shaitan. And there's, again, a lot more detail in all of these quotations and letters. And in lecture number 20, he threatens any of his governors, any of the people he appointed, that if they do any corruption, also in lecture number 40, he says that if they do any corruption, that Imam will leave them punished and humiliated. So the one person he was harsh against, the one people, were his own governors and appointees. And he also talks in lecture number 60, there's a lot of detail about the army. And again, in the interest of time, we won't go over the exact text of it, but it's available for anyone who's interested. But essentially, he talks about the boundaries between the army and the citizens. That as the army goes through, the army has certain rights, but they must be kept within their limits. And if they step outside of those limits and they steal any property or they're harsh to people, they don't have good akhlaq, you complain to the leader. But also they should be accommodated as they're going through lands, because they're going to sacrifice their lives in order to protect the people who they're going through. It's a very interesting balance that is drawn. And he even holds his armies to account when they fail or when they're not good enough in keeping away marauders. For example, in lecture number 61 of Nahjul Balagha, Imam, he castigates Kumail ibn Ziyad, who is one of his governors. And he says to him that you didn't do enough in stopping these marauders. And Kumail, he writes to Imam Ali, and he says, look, Muawiyah has sent these people to raid our lands. I think the best opportunity now is to do the same thing back to him. And Imam, he writes a letter back to him. He says, I did not expect such a suggestion from a man like you. It is more noble to guard your own people and your province than to plunder others. They might be our enemies, but they are still human beings. They consist of a civilian population which includes women and children. How can one kill, loot and plunder them? No, don't even dream of such a venture. So here are some of the details we've spoken about regarding the governance of Imam Ali. But now more specifically on the justice of Imam Ali within his government, there is one letter in particular which reigns king over all. That is lecture number 53, perhaps the most famous extract from Nahjul Balagha, the letter that he writes to his governor, Malik al-Ashtar, when he is going to become governor of Egypt. Malik al-Ashtar being his general, his right-hand man, his most trusted companion. And when he sends him over, he establishes some of the most wonderful rights in the history of Islam in this letter. When we talk about human rights in the history of Islam, it starts, of course, with the Quran and with the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet. We can move then to the constitution of Medina, which the Holy Prophet had with some of the Jews in Medina. Then we come to this letter of Imam Ali, and then we go to Risalat al-Huquq by the fourth Imam. That's how seminal this letter is. Now, number one, he says, and these pieces of advice that he gives in this letter to Malik al-Ashtar, yes, they are for governmental affairs, but they also apply to our own lives. So wherever we can see them through a lens that we can apply on ourselves in our daily dealings, it's essential to do so. Because if we claim to love the Imam, we would follow him. In lecture number 1, he starts, in lecture number 53, he starts by saying to fear God. Remember about the etiquettes of war, the first thing he said is pray to God. Here, the first thing he says is fear God. Because remember, God is put at the epicenter. And he says, because he knows that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, he says, when you are leader, do not tell the people that I am your overlord and I am your dictator. Therefore, bow before my commands, because that will corrupt your heart. It will weaken your faith and in your religion, and it will create disorder. And if ever you feel elated by the powers that you feel that you have, then just for a moment reflect on the universe and all the power that you don't have, that only Allah Almighty has the domain over. He says, look at the power and majesty of divine governance of the universe over which you have absolutely no control. So any arrogance, it is cut at its very root. And the Imam, he applies this, of course, to himself. In sermon number 223, he says, by Allah, if I was given all of the domains of the 7 stars and all that exists under the skies, in order to disobey Allah to the extent of taking 1 barley grain from an ant, by Allah I would not do it. For your world is lighter to me than the leaf in the mouth of a locust that is chewing it. What has Ali got to do with these bounties of this world that will pass and will not last? We seek protection from Allah from the slip of wisdom and the evil of mistakes. And he reminds in saying 241 that the day of the oppressed over the oppressor, when accountability is being delivered on the day of judgment, that will be much harsher than the day of the oppressor over the oppressed in this world. Always remember that. That is what Imam is saying. And he also talks about the equality between Muslims and non-Muslims when dealing in government. He says, habituate your heart to the mercy for the subjects and affection and kindness to them, and do not stand over them like greedy beasts and feel that it is enough to devour them. Because remember that men are of 2 kinds, either your brother in faith or your equal in creation. And again, Imam Ali, he lived by these words. There is a famous example that Ibn Kathir records in his Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, that whilst Imam Ali is Khalifa of the Muslims, he has the ultimate authority. He is walking through the streets and he realizes that a Christian man, he has his armor, the armor that Imam Ali, he lost at the Battle of Siffin. And so when he sees that, he approaches the Christian man and he says, look, I think you've got my armor. I would like you to give it back to me. And the Christian man responded by saying, no, actually, this is my armor, and I'm not going to give it back. So Imam Ali said, that's fine, because of course possession is half of the law. So he says that let's go to the judge. He takes him to Shuraih al-Qadi, Imam Ali's judge. But before the case is heard, Imam Ali, he reminds him, make sure that you judge with justice. So Shuraih, he says, okay, fine. So he says, Ya Ali, tell me, what is your case? He says, this is my armor. I have worn it. I recognize it. I've had it for much time. And after the Battle of Siffin, it must have fallen. I didn't see it, but I did not have it anymore. And as I was walking in the streets, I saw this man. He was in possession of it, and I would like it back. And Shuraih, he asks, Ya Ali, do you have any evidence? Do you have any witnesses? Do you have any proof? And Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says, I don't. This is all that I have. So Shuraih, apologetically, he says, Ya Ali, in that case, if the armor is in his possession, and you don't have any evidence for me to force the exchange of that possession, then I rule that that armor belongs to the Christian man. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he smiles, he thanks everyone for their time, and he walks away. All the while, the Christian man, he sits down wondering what on earth just happened. He thought that this was going to be a kangaroo court. He thought he was going to have to give the armor back, because he knew he had taken it. And he runs after Imam Ali. And he said, by Allah, I have just witnessed the justice of the prophets. Because he just saw that as a minority group in the land of the Muslims, he takes the Khalifa to court and he wins. He says, as for me, I testify this is the wisdom of the prophets. Amir al-Mu'mineen has himself taken me to his judge, and the judge ruled against him. I testify, La ilaha illallah Muhammadan Rasulullah. He says, by Allah, this armor, it belongs to you. I was following you when you were coming back from the Battle of Siffin, and it fell from your luggage. And Imam Ali says, well, since you have joined the religion of Islam, you may keep the armor as a gift. But this is the justice of Imam, with Muslims and with non-Muslims. And of course, the Imam, he took a very strong stance against any nepotism. There was no ability to put people in power because they were your relative. He says, Imam, in this letter to Malik al-Ashtar, do justice for Allah, and do justice towards the people just as you would do against your own self, against your near ones, against the subjects for whom you have a liking, because if you do not do so, you will be an oppressor. And if you are an oppressor over the creatures of Allah, then Allah will become your opponent. And when Allah becomes your opponent, He becomes the trampler of any of their pleas. So there is no nepotism. In saying number 23, he says that if somebody has a back position, they are further back because they are not as competent, they cannot be put in a forward position simply because of familial relation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this echoes the verse that Allah has given us, Surah An-Nisa, verse 135, the verse I recited at the beginning. O you who believe, uphold justice, bear witness to God, even against your own selves, even against your own parents, even against your own close relatives. For if the person is poor or they are rich, God can best take care of both of them. Refrain from following your own desire so you can act justly. And if you distort or neglect justice, Allah is aware of what you do. And so this is what Imam, he manifests in his life, even to the point of his own family. One of the brothers of the Imam comes to him when he is Khalifa. This is in Sermon 223, and he gives multiple examples in this sermon. He comes to Imam and he asks for a little bit more than his fair share. And it's not something which is that abhorrent. It's something that you would expect, right? If you are in a little bit of need and a relative of yours is in a position of power, very often, innocently, we may ask for favors without realizing the full implication. And so he asks just for a little bit more. And Imam, he reaches into the fireplace and he takes out a hot poker and he puts it near his brother. And his brother jumps away from it and he lets out a little shriek. And Imam Ali says that, goodness, you jump away and shriek from this fire that was created by man for play, and you ask me to go towards the fire that Allah has created for punishment. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And Imam says in lecture number 41 that by Allah, even if Al-Hasan wal-Hussein had done what you had done here, he says this to one of his oppressive governors, he says that there would not be any leniency on them from me, and that they would not have won their way with me until I had recovered their right and destroyed whatever wrong they had done unjustly. Of course, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, they are paragons of justice. They would never do anything, but Imam is saying even they are not free from the justice of the Imam. No nepotism here. And he says a lot of times in Nahjul Balagha, including lecture number 43. And Imam had a very strict policy regarding bribery. He says in lecture number 45, in that time when someone comes to Uthman ibn Hunayf and he brings some good food, and Uthman, he eats there without any obvious strings attached, Imam, he castigates him. He said he came forward with foods of different colors in large bowls, and it looks like that you are being fooled by this. I never thought that you would sit in the company of those who feed the rich and they keep the poor in hunger. And Imam, he doesn't just talk about bribery in the open sense. He says in lecture number 79, know that what ruined those before you was that they denied their rights and they purchased them with bribes, and it led them to wrong and they were followed. So Imam is very, very in opposition to bribes. But even more subtle things, like this example of Uthman ibn Hunayf, it's not an obvious bribe. In another case, Imam Ali, he is approached by a man called Ash'ath ibn Qais. And he comes with a tray of sweets to give to the Imam. And the Imam stops him. He says, what are you doing? Is this zakat? Is this sadaqah? Because remember, I am of Ahlul Bayt. I'm not allowed to eat sadaqah. I'm not allowed to eat zakat. And Ash'ath, he said, no, it's neither of that. It is just a gift. And Imam Ali, he says, may your mother grieve over you. You really think you can ruin my religion? By Allah, if I was given the universe, I would not take a grain of barley unjustly from an ant. And these examples are important because it's about the subtleties. Normally when we think of bribery, we think of someone in power. Oh, hello, salamu alaikum, here's £20. Please put something in my favor. Please pass this law, get my friend out of prison, whatever it might be. Usually it's a bit more than £20, but whatever. But Imam highlights here that it is not just that which falls into that case, also another form of bribery which takes place today. In all of our modern politics, we give it a euphemistic name, though we don't call it bribery, we call it lobbying. You pay some money to their campaign. You pay some money to a super PAC. You pay a money to some organization which feeds into the political system, and it gives you more influence over that person than you would have had if you did not give that money. It is bribery. It is just thinly veiled. And Imam, he castigates anybody who engages in this action. He also ensures, Imam, in his government, that there is freedom of expression. He says in lecture number 53 again, O Malik, I have sent you to an area where there have been governments before you, those who have been also oppressive. So people will watch over your dealings as the same way they watched over the dealings of people before you, and they will criticize you as they criticize their rulers. Surely the virtuous are known by their reputation, and Allah spreads this on the tongues of His creatures. Therefore, the best collection you should garner is a collection of good deeds. And Imam highlights the fact that once you are a public figure, once you are in a position of power, the ordinary rules of ghiba no longer apply to you. Normally, if someone does something wrong or someone does something bad, as long as we're not being a party to oppression, we try and look the other way. We try and give them excuses. But not when it comes to leaders. Again, Imam was very harsh to his own governors. When you take a public position, we should be ready for criticism. There was an occasion in the Khilafah of Imam Ali, a man called Mughira bin Shu'bah, he erects a minaret within his own house. And from that minaret, he sends his curses upon Imam Ali. The people, they go to Imam Ali, they say, Ya Ali, you are Khalifa, put an end to this nonsense. Imam Ali said that if he is doing it from his own home, and his words are only against me, then he is free to do what he wants. Imam also establishes in this letter social security. Take care of the orphans and the aged who have no means of livelihood nor are ready for begging. And fix a time also, lend your ear to the complainants and make yourself free for them and sit down in the common audience and feel humble in their presence for the sake of Allah. And the lowest class of the needy and the destitute, for them help is an obligation and everyone has a share in the livelihood in the name of Allah. He followed in the footsteps of his teacher and his master, Rasul al-A'zam. Beforehand, he looked after the poor, just as his teacher did. As he is walking through the streets, he sees there is a Christian man who is destitute and begging on the side of the road, and he asks, who is this man under my governance, who is living like this? And they see he's a Christian man. He used to work, but he got a bit ill, he got a bit old. He can't look after himself anymore. And Imam, he castigates his followers. He says, look, you use him when he can give, and you abandon him when he can no longer give. He must have his stipend from the public treasury. So he looked after them, whether they were Muslims or not, and he also ensured intelligence in justice. This is essential. Some of the conditions of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar, they focus around knowledge. We can't put down justice with an iron fist if we don't have the knowledge or the information, because then we will be doing more harm than good. He says in letter 53, avoid haste in matters before their time, slowness at their proper time, insistence upon them when the propriety of action is not known, or it weakens when it becomes clear. Assign every matter to its proper place and every job its appropriate time. There's an interesting story in Hayat al-Qulub about a man who comes to the masjid, a young man, and he's crying profusely. Imam Ali enters the masjid, he sees the cries and the wails of this young man, and he approaches him because as Khalifa he is concerned for every one of his citizens, rich, poor, powerful or weak, young or old. He approaches him, he says, what has brought you to this state? He says that my father went on a trading expedition and he never came back. And when those people he went with, when they came back, they said he died and he left no property. And he said, well, have you got justice? He said, well, I went to your judge, Shurayh al-Qadi, and I petitioned my case against those men because I know he had property. And Shurayh asked me for evidence. I had no evidence to give. And so Shurayh, he said that if you have no evidence, unfortunately, possession is half of the law, right? They have the property, it's theirs to keep. But Imam Ali said, this is not enough. He says, I will show you the justice of Nabi Dawood. And so he gathers all of the accused in the masjid. And he takes them, he puts them at different pillars of the mosque. And he blindfolds them so that they cannot see what the other one is and they cannot hear. And then he approaches each one of them. And he asks them, what was the trip that you went on? Who did you go with? How long was he with you? When did he fall sick? How long was his illness? Where did he fall sick? Where did he pass away? Exactly how much did he leave? Where did he lose his money? So on and so forth. All of these details. And he went to each of these people one after the other. And when he finished speaking to any one of them, he loudly said, Allahu Akbar. This is, again, the manipulation or at least the understanding of psychology of Imam Ali. Because when the other people, they could not hear the conversation, but they could hear Imam saying Allahu Akbar, they would have thought that their companion had spilled the truth. And so he went from pillar to pillar until every one of them had confessed that they killed the man and they stole his property. And when it comes to justice, and it comes to establishing rule between right and wrong, that if there is a gray area and we are unsure which way to tip, towards harshness or towards mercy, Imam, he reminds us to move towards mercy. He says again in lecture number 53, to Malik al-Ashtar, habituate your heart to mercy for the subjects and to the affection and kindness to them. They will commit slips. They will encounter mistakes. They may act wrongfully, willingly or by neglect. So extend to them your forgiveness and pardon, in the same way that you would hope that Allah will extend His forgiveness and His pardon to you. Because you are over them and their responsible commander, whilst it is Allah who has appointed you over them. So Imam is saying, if you have to err one way or the other, always err towards mercy. Always move towards politeness. Always move towards forgiveness, softness. And remember, again, this is following in the sunnah of his master Rasul. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran that, Ya Rasulullah, if you had been hard of heart, غَلِيظُ الْقَلْبِ, then the people would have dispersed from around you. So implying that it was the softness of his heart and the softness and the kindness that he used that made people come to him like moths come to a flame. And this, in tonight's discussion, has been but a glance, but a small look at a fraction of the justice that we find of Imam Ali just within Nahjul Balagha. There is so much more in the letter of Malik al-Ashtar alone. Again, it is worth reading in its entirety. And elsewhere in Nahjul Balagha and elsewhere in the books and the annals of history. But looking at what we have learned over these nights and seeing the wisdom that Imam reflects throughout Nahjul Balagha, we find that Imam, he is the complete man. That he is the perfect combination of these antithetical qualities, which don't normally garner or gather in one person. And he seamlessly integrates them together, to the extent that he earns the respect and the praise from Muslims and non-Muslims alike. We'll take one quote from Edward Gibbon in one of the most important books in all of history, about history, in the history of the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire. Throughout it, by the way, when you read through this book, it's several volumes long, whenever he mentions Imam Ali, he does so with the utmost respect. Always calls him a hero, a wonderful person. And in this quote, he says, "The zeal and the virtues of Ali were never outstripped by any recent proselyte. He united the qualification of poet and soldier and saint. His wisdom still breathes in a collection of moral and religious sayings," which appears to be an allude to Nahjul Balagha. So his wisdom still breathes in a collection of moral and religious sayings, and in every antagonist the combats of tongue or of sword were subdued by his eloquence and his valor.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
From the first hour of the mission to the last rites of his funeral, the messenger, Rasulullah, was never forsaken by this generous friend, whom he delighted to name his brother, his vicegerent, and the faithful Harun to a second Musa.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
The light of Imam's justice and of his prowess and of his accomplishments, they far reach beyond the limits of the Muslims. And Imam Ali alayhi salam, he did not take this justice just with him to his grave, for he also taught it to his sons. This softness, this kindness, this looking after the oppressed, taking care of principles over results, looking after even the meek and the disenfranchised in society.